Hello, and welcome to this webinar on power, anger, and assertiveness. My name is Dr. Evan Hoffman. I'm a peace building and conflict resolution expert with over 15 years of experience and an instructor with Brāv. So it's my great pleasure to share my knowledge and experience with you through this webinar. This webinar is the fourth in a series of a package of 4, and perhaps you've joined me for one or two of the earlier webinars. So the entire package is called the Online Dispute Resolution, or ODR Expert Package. And the idea is that hopefully you've already paid your registration fee to attend this webinar and registered to take the quiz. So there's a short quiz at the end of this webinar that I will share with you. The quiz is pretty easy, it's not too onerous. The quiz really has two purposes. One is to ensure that you've viewed the entire webinar, and secondly, the purpose of the quiz is to make sure that you've picked up some of the major ideas from the webinar and are prepared to put them into practice as a brave one. So once you finish off the quiz, write the quiz, submit it to nextgenerationmediation@gmail.com. We'll do a review of your quiz results, and upon a successful review, you'll be able to add this training to your Brave One profile. So yeah, let's take a look then at the outline for this webinar. It's actually fairly simple. As the title suggests, we're really looking at 3 major topics today. We're looking at power, anger, and assertiveness. And the intent here, by the way, is to run for about 45 minutes to maybe an hour, just so you're aware of that. Hopefully, at this stage, you might be thinking, why has Dr. Hoffman put together these 3 particular topics? And one of the things that I'm hoping you'll see by the end of the webinar is that these 3 things are actually very closely linked. So without much further ado, let's move on to our next slide. So we're beginning our examination by looking at power. And there's a quote here that says, "Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun." Now, this is a common conception, if you will, that equates force, and particularly, say, military force, or we could interchange the word violence there, and it's saying violence equals power. I'm going to take a counter view to that, and I'm going to say that power is more than force, and force does not equal power. And if that's, I don't want to confuse you, so hopefully that'll be clear in the next slide or two. But I would ask you then, going forward, to think about how would you possibly define power. And chances are likely that you've never actually paused in your own life to really think about this, if you had to define it to someone else, or maybe in an essay if you're a university student. We all have experienced power throughout all of our lives, so it's a familiar thing to us. There are power dynamics that occur in schools in terms of authority, and the teachers having control over the students to a certain extent, and the principal and the school administration. There are power dynamics that occur in our families, and of course there are power dynamics that occur in the political realm and in our workplace. But so we can all agree that power is prevalent. It's all around us. It's something we've experienced from early on in our lives. But what we're looking at here then is how do we define power? What is it really? And so one common conception is that power is force. If I use force, I'm exerting my power. Now, if I was in a classroom setting, of course, we would pause here and we would go around the room, and I'd ask each of you to share your definition of power with me and with the rest of the class. However, since that's not possible, what I can do is tell you that when I've delivered this training in classroom settings, what usually happens is that people in the room will equate very specific resources with power. So someone will say, well, if I have information, then I've got power. Think maybe about a negotiation or something for buying a house. If I have information about, what the lowest possible offer the seller will accept, then I've got more power in that negotiation. So there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. Some people say money. If I've got lots of money, then I've got lots of power. I can make things happen. I can get things I want, and so on and so forth. And to a certain extent, money is power, but power is more than that. Some people say time. Time is power. And others will say other very specific resources, and they can list off all kinds of resources such as knowledge or wisdom, or if I have a certain degree or training or a certain status in my community. And the point is that I'm trying to make is it's an error to assume that power is any one specific resource. And resources only have power based on the context. However, so power does involve resources to some extent, but it's specific to the context. But we also have to talk about the outcomes. We have to talk about power is getting what you want, or an outcome that you want. And so if we look at the next slide, we say, well, what then is power if it's not just resources? We can say, here's one definition: the ability to cause or prevent a change. So you notice in this definition that it's very much talking about an outcome. It's not saying this resource or that resource is power. It's saying that if I can cause something to happen, then I have power. So just before I got on this webinar today, I saw that the North Korea has again launched an intercontinental ballistic missile, and I got thinking of whether I could bring this example into this webinar, and yes, I can. If we say that the desired outcome of the United States and other Western countries is to prevent North Korea from acquiring a nuclear weapon, then we have to, so that's the kind of outcome we're trying to create. Then you say, look at what we've done in the past, we put sanctions on and so on and so forth, and we haven't slowed necessarily or completely stopped them from developing a nuclear weapon. So in other words, from this perspective of power, we have to say that the West has been powerless to prevent this from happening. We have not been able to create the change in the intended direction that we want. Okay, so when we talk about defining power, we think about resources, but we also think about outcomes. So here's another one. Power is capacity. Again, capacity is really a resource. Power is capacity. Power is the ability to do something. So this is kind of, again, suggesting it's an outcome-based definition of power. Both of these are outcome-based. However, what we don't get with either of these definitions is a clear and simple idea of power that combines both resources and outcomes. So what I'm going to share with you on my next slide is just that. So the Canadian International Institute of Applied Negotiation, that's the organization where I'm a senior associate in Canada, we have done extensive research and training on the idea of power. You can imagine, I've already talked about one example of power in negotiation. Power is very much a central feature in many, many negotiations. So as negotiation experts, we have to understand power, and we have to understand the role of power in negotiations. So based on our thinking and our research, the definition that we've come up with is as follows. We say that power equals resources mobilized by skills because of a clear decision to produce an intended outcome. Resources mobilized by skills as a result of a clear decision to create the outcome I want. So if we unpack that, you can see that, you know, we're combining outcomes with resources, but we're also going a little bit more in depth in our definition, because we're saying someone can have the resources, but if they don't have the skill to utilize those resources, then they're actually powerless. So let me try to give you an example. Let's say the intended outcome I want to create is I want to build a new deck to barbecue on the back of my house. And so I know that I'm clear with my decision to do that, and I want to direct all of my energies and everything towards making this outcome happen. So there's a psychological component there too, to using your power, in that you have to be firm and clear with your outcome, and ready to direct all resources to achieving that outcome. But that's a side conversation. So I want to build my deck. That's my outcome. I have a clear decision to do that. Now, in terms of resources, let's imagine I don't have the lumber. Obviously, I don't have the power then to create my deck. Let's imagine, though, that I do have the money to buy the lumber, so I buy nails and screws and hammers and the drills and all the deck planking I'm going to need and the railing material. So I've got all the resources. I'm still completely powerless to reach that outcome of building that deck if I don't know how to actually work a skill saw and how to put a deck together. And I don't have the skills to take all of my raw resources and use them to reach the outcome I want to create. So I don't want to spend too much time on this definition, but I just want to reinforce a couple ideas here. One is that resources and skills are really part of exercising your power. To exercise your power, you have to have a clear decision, so there's a psychological decision-making component involved in it. And then lastly, power is not just having resources and having the ability to use the resources. Real power is producing the actual intended outcome you want. So this is a simple yet comprehensive definition, and I've used this as a planning tool. You can work backwards from this as well. So you can say, here's the outcome I want to produce. Let's imagine the outcome is I want to go to grad school and I want to get my master's degree. So you start from your outcome, and then you work backwards. You say, what do I have a clear decision? Like, do I really want to get my master's, or do I want to work for another couple of years and save up money? So you work through all of the psychological decision-making components. You get that out of the way. You say, well, yes, a master's degree makes sense. I'm clear about that. I'm going to try to make it happen. So then you work backwards from there, and you say, what specific resources do I need to get my master's degree? Well, I need books and tuition, and I need good reference letters to get into school, and I'm going to need good essay writing skills, and so on and so forth. So then you begin to list all of the resources that you need, and then you set out starting to acquire those resources and the skills to mobilize them. And arguably, this then becomes a planning tool, or a way to map out a road to reach the outcome that you want to create. So that's one very interesting thing about this definition of power, is that it's a planning tool. Pardon me. The other interesting thing with this is that we can also use this definition to evaluate and assess and measure and begin to quantify levels of power between different parties in a conflict or a negotiation. So let's imagine we were hired to analyze some big negotiations that are occurring, and we were asked to assess the role of power in the negotiations. Well, what we can do then is, for each of the parties, we can begin to say, does this party have a clear outcome that they want to reach in the negotiation? And if so, what resources do they have, and which resources are they lacking? So then what we get is a kind of a crude measurement of the overall power between the parties, and we can see if there's a power imbalance. So here's an example with that particular definition of power. let's say our intended outcome is clearly stated that we want the new landfill to be moved out of our county. And so we're firmly resolved to reach that outcome. Well, then, as a planning tool, we can say we need these specific resources and these skills to reach this outcome. So we need legal advice and enough money to pay for it. We might need impartial scientific research on the environmental impacts of this landfill and the money to pay for that research project. We might need to generate political will to get the politicians on our side and public support on our side. So do we have resources to launch a public awareness campaign and get the public on our side? We also need negotiation skills training and the money to hire the trainer to train us. So again, we're using the CN definition of power as a way to plan a way forward to execute our power to reach our intended outcome. Okay, so this next slide here, it says beliefs about power, and we want you to list 2 or 3 words that come to mind when you think about power. And so I'm gonna ask you to do that right now. And again, if I was in a classroom setting, I would invite people to share their beliefs about power. And normally what we find, kind of an interesting thing, is that no matter where I've run this exercise and with any group, whether it's government people or university students and so on and so forth, a lot of times people have very negative connotations about power and kind of negative beliefs. I'm not sure why that is, but the idea that from this exercise is that I'm trying to reinforce the point that if you think about what do you believe about power and the use of power, that hopefully you're going to find that we all hold very deep beliefs or what we might call value systems, and I talked about values in some of my other webinars. And really our deepest beliefs or our deepest values are going to help determine how we choose to exert our power. So just to help illustrate this point, I've got on this next slide, and I apologize if that's small on your particular screen. I'm not going to go over all of these, but these are particular belief statements, I guess would be the term, about power. So let me go over just a few to give you a taste of the kind of things that people believe about power. Power cannot be given to another person. Well, that's interesting. Some people may believe that and some people may not. Some people may say, well, power transfers from person to person, like the office of the President of the United States. They have power because the position, and it doesn't matter who the person is, whether it's Donald Trump or President Obama or President Bush or President Carter, it's not, the power is not necessarily in that person. The power resides in the office. What else do we have on here? To feel unempowered is to be unempowered. So if I feel like I have no power, I actually don't have any power. Unanswered threats can be read as a weakness. So again, I'm going to go back to the North Korea example. If North Korea launches a missile, if we ignore that threat and don't respond, does that show that we are disinterested, don't care, or that we are weak? To demonstrate our power, do we have to now increase sanctions? Do we now have to launch our own missiles or do a military flyby and respond to the threat? So there are some people that believe that if you don't display your power and make it prominent and make everyone aware of your power, then you will be regarded as weak. Here's a very controversial one, the next one, and I'll read it out, but I'm not going to say too much about it. Women are too emotional to be powerful. To be powerful is to be disliked. The destructive use of power is a direct result of early childhood powerlessness. Okay, so lots of different beliefs. Some of these on here maybe resonate with you, some of these you agree with, and some you don't. But again, I just want to reiterate the idea that we all have these deeply held beliefs, and if we were to go around a room, we would find that there's a wide range of different people with different beliefs, because really these are part of our kind of our worldview, and these beliefs come through our experiences and our upbringing and so on and so on and so forth, and they're such deeply part of our value system that they're very difficult to change these beliefs. Okay, so talking about power, we've defined it very specifically as resources and skills and outcomes and a decision. Another major way to think about power is to think about hard power versus soft power. And this idea is normally credited to Joseph Nye. So he says power is the ability to affect others to get the things we want. So again, it's talking about ability or capacity, and it's talking about that combined with outcomes to get the things we want. So in his research and thinking and writing about power, he realized there are fundamentally a major distinction can be made between what we would call hard power and soft power. And for any international relations students out there, or anyone who's an avid reader in international relations, hard power and soft power is sometimes equated as carrots and sticks. So the soft power is carrots. Let's dangle a carrot and try to get someone to do something by offering a reward. And hard power is equated normally with the stick. Let's threaten someone with a stick to get them to do what we want. So hard power, according to the definition on your screen here, is basically equated with coercion. In other words, twisting people to do what you want and threatening them through force or sticks or negative consequences and so on and so forth. Soft power, on the other hand, is related to gentle persuasion and attraction and offering rewards, things that people want. So the thinking about power went a little bit further, and they said not only is there hard versus soft power, but what we can do in some cases is combine hard and soft power, and what we get is smart power. So in other words, how can we create the changes we want through the strategic linking of the carrots and the sticks, through the threats of punishments and the offers of rewards to do what we want people to do. So that's one major distinction between one way to think about power. There's any power can be kind of labeled as that's either hard power or soft power. However, another major distinction says that there's really three different types of power. So we've got power over, power through, and power with. So power over in some ways is equated with the force aspect or hard power. It's about using my power over top of you to pressure you into doing something I want you to do. Power through is more of a neutral use of power, and power with is more of a cooperative, collaborative, working with you, combining our power together to get what we want to get done. So not surprisingly then, most people have a preference for power with approaches. Almost no one would want to have a conflict solved by having someone else use power over you, because you have the smallest degree of control over the process and the outcome. So it's not very hard to think of power over situations. Think of in a jail, for example. Jails are very much built on a power over system where my personal power to go where I want, do what I want, eat what I want, so on and so forth, that's all been stripped of me in jail. And basically now the prison guards or the correctional officers are utilizing power over. They're controlling the schedule, they're controlling the type of food that's served, when it's served. If we act out, then we are punished by being put into solitary confinement and other types of punishment. So it's all very much a power over kind of world. And there are, unfortunately, there are workplaces where this is similar, where maybe upper management or senior management uses kind of authoritarian threats and stuff to get their employees to do what they want them to do. You could think of, say, dictators and kind of authoritarian regimes. Different countries function in kind of a power over mode. So obviously, for the people experiencing power over being used against them, it's not necessarily very pleasant. Power through, on the other hand, if administered in a fair and transparent manner, can actually result in some satisfactory outcomes. So one of the studies that I'm aware of that helps to reinforce this idea is that if I have a dispute with my neighbor and I can go to an arbitrator. An arbitrator is someone who will listen to both of our stories about, let's imagine we're fighting about where the fence should be positioned on the property line. The arbitrator will listen to both of our stories, and then the arbitrator will make a ruling. It's kind of like a court system in many ways. The arbitrator will make a ruling in favor of either the neighbor or myself. And what they found when looking at satisfaction with arbitration is that many people accepted the arbitrator's ruling if they felt the process was a fair one and transparent. And so even if they ruled against them, they said, well, I'm maybe not happy, I wish they would have ruled in my favor, but at least, it was a fair and transparent process. So this is very much a power through. Of course, if we take the same example and we say, what would a power over result look like for that? That would be me marching out there with a rifle or a shotgun or something and threatening my neighbor and saying, don't you dare put that fence there or else, I'm going to start shooting, kind of thing. So that's a power over, use of force, use of threat. Power through would be us resolving that conflict by going to an arbitrator. And in power with, I would sit down with my neighbor and work together and see them as a kind of an equal who, this is a shared problem of both of ours and we both have power to achieve some kind of outcome here. Let's see if we can create a win-win outcome. And so the technique would be negotiation. So power over would be threats, use of force, violence, using a rifle. Power through is arbitration. Power with would be negotiation. So it says here, power with, while not always a real possibility in all situations. We have to be aware that maybe even it's desirable to use power with, it's not always possible, is perhaps the best choice because it gives the parties maximum control over both the process and the outcome. And the idea is that if both of us are involved in the process and both of us are involved in the outcome, arguably we should have reached an outcome we both like. Arguably, therefore, it should be implemented quite easily. Arguably, therefore, it should be a durable, lasting outcome. So lastly, it says here, negotiation is one type of process that allows for power with solutions to be generated. And we could add to this, of course, that the Brāv One online platform and the dialogues that you are going to hold on the platform are another venue or another method or another technique of using power with. Now, I don't want to get too far off track here, but there's a possibility that the people coming onto the session with you are living in a power over world where one wants to dominate the other one and threaten the other one and so on and so forth. And that raises a whole set of other concerns that we can't address in this webinar necessarily. But how do you shift the parties from power over modality to approaching the problem in a power with perspective? Okay, so that's kind of what we're talking about here on this next slide. It says from power with to power through. And I would argue that if you actually studied most conflicts from start to finish, and you look at the different types of power that have been used during that conflict, you will see that in any given conflict situation, it's not unusual for a variety of different techniques to be utilized at different points in time. For example, the parties might opt to first try resolving their conflict via power over. Then, or when, if that proves ineffective in resolving the conflict, they may turn to power with techniques such as negotiation, and then if negotiation fails, then they might turn to a different technique such as arbitration, which leaves them with less power over the outcome. So in arbitration, like I mentioned before, either a binding or a non-binding decision is provided to the parties by the arbitrator after each party has had an opportunity to present their case. So the parties are early in their conflict. They're thinking, I've got, I can solve this conflict. I can beat the other person. I can threaten them into doing what I want them to do. And they try that approach and they try that approach, and their threats aren't getting them anywhere, and the threat of violence isn't getting anywhere, and then they might say, okay, well, now if I'm presented with the opportunity to actually sit down and try to solve this problem in a different way, maybe I'll now use power with. So what you'll find, just to reiterate the key point here, is that parties will likely shift their conflict styles, if you will, or their use of power throughout the conflict, depending on the different dynamics and so on and so forth. Okay, so all of that really leads to what we might call a power struggle, where one party is using power over against the other one, and then the other one retaliates with their power over in order to get the upper hand. And what happens is that it leads to a natural escalation. And so again, I have to turn back to my North Korea example. And so North Korea launches a missile, and then in response we kind of up the ante, if you will. We respond with some kind of power over approach that further threatens the other country, and then they feel weaker because of that, so then they up the ante, and you can see how it goes tit for tat, and this thing quickly spirals and it escalates. And so that's one of the real concerns I've seen with different analysts looking at the North Korea situation, are saying, unless intentional de-escalation techniques are taken, we are kind of headed down a path of natural escalation. And so that's part of a power struggle. So I'm saying on this slide that there are two, you hear the phrase all the time, it's a power struggle, at the office or in that family, there's a power struggle between the husband and the wife, or the mom and the dad. And we're saying what actually is a power struggle, and if you unpack that and you begin to look at the definition of it, you would say one aspect of a power struggle is that the parties are using power over back and forth against each other, always ratcheting it up and escalating the tensions and escalating the chance that there's going to be a really serious violent confrontation at some point. The other aspect of a power struggle is that the parties become locked into their rigid positions. And so I mentioned before that hopefully you see the parties shift from a power over approach to a power with, where they're ready to sit down and negotiate and talk things through and try to work out a solution, seeing their partner as an equal. And if the parties are refusing to shift into that kind of world or that kind of headspace, then that's another element that they're locked inside their power struggle, and they don't want to appear to be weak. And there are things, this is probably for another webinar, but there are lots of things that can be done in a power struggle to help the parties out of that. One, for example, is you can allow them to save face. So in other words, how do you create an opportunity for them to kind of back down or step away without looking weak? Okay, so power struggles, they happen all the time. Two aspects of a power struggle, and there are some techniques for resolving power struggles. Power imbalances, what is that? What do you think a power imbalance might be before I share my answer with you? Power imbalance. Okay, again, this is a definition from the Canadian International Institute of Applied Negotiation. It says, a power imbalance occurs when one party consistently holds more power than the other and uses this to its own advantage. So in other words, sometimes we call this maybe structural or systemic oppression, where the game is tilted in my favor and I use that to my advantage to continually hold you down or keep you unempowered or to limit you expressing your power. So in some ways, when you, again, let's go back to the example of the prison system, and I've already mentioned that's very much a power over kind of world where everything is built around the power over concept. You could also see, if you were analyzing the prison system from a power balance perspective, it wouldn't take you very long to realize that there's a clear power imbalance in favor of the prison guards and the staff and the correctional officers, and that's intentional, of course, for that environment, and it makes sense. You wouldn't want to be treating necessarily the prisoners like equals for some security type reasons, but there are things that are done, again, within the rules and the structure and the policies and the whole design of a prison system that intentionally creates a power imbalance where the one of the parties in that system is their power is limited. Okay, so that's one example, and I'm asking you here to think about, if you can think of another example of a power imbalance that you're aware of, maybe in a family, maybe in a workplace, maybe racial relations in a city or something. Begin to think about what are some of the symptoms of the power imbalance that would let us know that there is a clear power imbalance. So then, if we become aware that there is a power imbalance, the next question is, do we balance or not balance the power? And I say here that, well, there are some situations in which maintaining an imbalance of power is preferable. For example, the prison system that I just mentioned, to me that makes sense that we maintain that imbalance of power within that particular setting because of what we're trying to achieve there. There is a growing body of research that seems to suggest that the best outcomes in conflicts are reached when the balance of power between the parties is equalized. So sometimes we are aware of a power imbalance, and that power imbalance is serving some kind of important function, so we don't want to touch it. In other situations, particularly conflict resolution and peace-building situations, to empower or co-empower the other party from a peace-building conflict resolution perspective can be the right thing, or the ethical thing to do, or the thing to do in order just to reach the best possible outcome. So then if you get to that point in your thinking where you say there is a power imbalance, we should try to balance it, you can't just leave it at that. You have to say, well, this begs the question, what would we actually possibly do to actually balance the power? And I can give you one example from the real world. Bosnia was there was a very severe war there in the 1990s, genocide and so on and so forth. And Richard Holbrooke was an American diplomat who was in charge of the final peace process that eventually led to the signing of the Dayton Agreement. The Dayton Agreement effectively brought the war to a close. And Richard Holbrooke recognized that one of the parties in the peace process weren't quite as good negotiators, and they didn't have the resources to get legal expertise like the other party. And so what he did before one of the peace talk sessions that was scheduled is he arranged for that weaker party to meet with a number of lawyers in New York City, I think it was, if I recall correctly. And I'm not sure now if the other party knew that he was supporting them and helping to empower them, but the fact of the matter is he did that. He said this party here, they're not quite as good negotiators, they don't have good legal advice, and so he arranged for them to get that so that they'd be on more equal footing when they actually entered the peace talks. So that's one way to level the power, is to provide the other party with the resources that they're missing or the skills that they're missing, and so on and so forth. So that kind of loops back to our earlier definition about power being resources mobilized by skills as an intentional decision to reach a desired outcome. Okay, so to conclude, if there's one key lesson to take away from this discussion on power, it is pay attention to the role of power in conflicts and negotiations, plus be prepared to account for these power dynamics. So now we're going to shift gears to anger. Anger is one of 7 basic emotions, and so you can see this woman on the right here. Anger can be recognized by this picture all around the world, no matter what age, religion, gender you are, or what language you speak. One definition of anger is that anger is an emotion characterized by antagonism towards someone or something you feel has deliberately done you wrong. I'm going to skip this one for the sake of time. So anger is a misunderstood emotion. Emotions occur in response to a specific stimulus or a precipitating event. So anger is therefore an emotional response to a conflict and not a cause of conflict. So conflict is thus often perceived to be uncomfortable. Anger might mask other emotions such as hurt, shame, and fear, which in other words is frustrated expectation. So in this case, anger is used as a defense mechanism to avoid experiencing these other intense feelings. Some emotions are accompanied by an action tendency. So the action tendency for anger is to attack or violence. Therefore, anger can contribute to a non-violent conflict escalating into a violent conflict. In other words, aggression is the behavioral component that accompanies anger. So now I hope you're starting to see how power and anger and violence are all starting to link together. Anger follows a cycle, so that when anger is highest, your rational judgment is lowest. So don't make any major decisions while angry. So all of this leads to the question then, is anger good or bad? And I would argue that anger isn't always bad. It can be a motivating force or serve as an important signal that some type of injustice or abuse is occurring. For example, anger along with happiness are actually 2 emotions that can play a helpful role in negotiation. The key is that the anger must be directed at the problematic behaviors and not the person. So don't attack the person, attack the behavior. And as a side note, we're soon going to talk about assertion, and that's one of the things is that we're going to request through assertion, request specific behavior changes. So in other words, the key then to express your anger constructively without any violence and deal with the primary problem that led to the emergence of anger. So there are 2 goals of anger management. One is to diffuse the other party's anger and allow them to manage the emotional climate, so you are allowing room for safe venting. Another aspect of anger management is managing your own anger, knowing how to say no and how to set limits. So we're talking about assertiveness, not aggressiveness, that protects your own interests and needs is very important. Or, according to the American Psychological Association, I have a quote here that kind of reinforces this idea. The goal of anger management is to reduce both your emotional feelings and the physiological arousal that anger causes. You can't get rid of or avoid the things or the people that enrage you, nor can you change them, but you can learn to control your reactions. So the linkage then between assertion and anger hopefully is starting to become clear. So it's true that angry people need to learn to become assertive rather than aggressive, like I've noted a couple times. But most books and courses on developing assertiveness are aimed at people who don't feel enough anger. These people are more passive than the average person. They tend to let others walk all over them. this isn't something that most angry people do, still these books contain some useful tactics to use in frustrating situations. So remember, you can't eliminate anger, and it wouldn't be a good idea if you could. In spite of all of your efforts, things will happen that will cause you anger, and sometimes it will be justifiable anger. Life will be filled with frustration, pain, loss, and the unpredictable actions of others. You can't change that, but you can change the way you let these events affect you. Controlling your anger responses can keep them from making you even more unhappy in the long run. So what exactly then are these assertion skills that we keep alluding to that can help with anger, and to help with anger from turning into aggressiveness or violence? So that's really the link there. We've got anger, aggression or violence, and then assertion skills. So one of the main ideas with assertion skills then is you don't blame the other person. You would own your statements and make it an I statement. And then there's a formula here that has 3 parts. And you say, when you do something or another, very specific behavior there, I feel this way or that way because of this. So you're letting the other person know that their behaviors and actions are affecting you in such and such a way. So you're making that an I statement. You're not saying to the other person, you're a horrible person for doing what you do. You're just making them aware that your behaviors are affecting me in this particular way. But what we don't have at this stage is any request for a behavior change. You're simply letting the other person know how you feel or how you're reacting to their actions. So what we have to combine with the assertion skills are skills for limit setting. And so there are 4 tips for setting limits with another person. 1 is you acknowledge the other person's feelings. 2 is you would show interest in solving the problem. 3 is you describe the other's behaviors and express your reaction to this behavior. So that's really what we did on our last slide. And 4 is you specify that you want the behavior to stop, and you state the positive consequences for both in doing so. So you can imagine that as a professor, I sometimes have students approaching me who are angry with the grade they got or something or other, and they might say, Dr. Hoffman, you're a terrible professor, and I've never got such a bad grade in my entire life. And there's lots of different ways I can react to that personal attack and that angry person. But if I was to use limit setting, what I would do is I would acknowledge, show interest, describe the other behavior and my reaction to the behavior, and then specify that I want that behavior to stop. So I might say, I'm understand that you're upset with the grade you got on your essay, and that you are quite upset and flustered about that. I'm willing to talk to you about this a little bit more and explain the reason you got that particular grade. When you march into my office and send personal attacks at me, that's unacceptable, and I want that behavior to stop. That won't be tolerated. And if we can approach this as mature people and sit down and talk through this, then it'll be good consequences for both of us. So that's kind of an example there of how you would take these 4 different tips for limit setting and work them into a reply if an angry person marched into your office. And in a lot of cases, I find that customer service representatives are quite good at this, at least with steps 1 and 2. If you call up your internet service provider or someone and you've got a problem with a product you purchased, often if it's good customer service reps on the other end, they'll often say, well, sir, thank you for letting us know you've got a concern with our product. I'm happy to talk about this or discuss our return policy with you. So that's really step 1 and 2, and the customer service people really seem to have that down to a fine art. Okay, so now I'm going to conclude the entire webinar. I see we're right on time here, 10 minutes to the hour. What hopefully is clear to you now, and I mentioned this at the very, very start, is that power, anger, and assertiveness are all linked. I would add into that, actually, power, anger, violence / aggression, and assertiveness are all linked. And by understanding the different sources and forms of power, plus how they relate to the expression of anger, or being frustrated or powerless, we can use limit setting to assert which behaviors are and are not acceptable during a session. Okay, so if you like this particular webinar, don't forget to sign up for the other 3 webinars that are in this webinar series. They were on one of my slides at the start of the presentation. There's conflict prevention webinars, and one on preventing youth violence, and one on peace leadership. So now we will move to the quiz. Again, you just copy your answers into an email and email your completed quiz to Brāv at nextgenerationmediation@gmail.com. The quiz for this particular webinar has 2 questions. So the first question here says, list 2 things indicating that one of the parties is using their power over the other party during an online Brāv session that you're facilitating. So what could happen during your session that would suggest to you that one party is dominating or using power over the other party? Or you, actually, as a matter of fact, as the facilitator. Okay, so that's the first question. And that should be relatively easy and straightforward to answer if you've watched this entire webinar. Secondly, how would you determine if a party is displaying good versus bad anger during a session? Okay, so there you have it. Thank you for joining me. This concludes this particular webinar, and I hope you'll join me in the other webinars. So thank you, take care, and have a great day. Bye-bye.